Good morning. Brother Chad Long here from Delhi Baptist Church. I hope you're having a good morning so far. We're going to dive right in this morning because I don't want to drag this out unnecessarily, but I hope everybody is doing well, and I hope you're ready to open your Bibles and study with me. We're in Joshua chapter 23, toward the end of the chapter. We'll begin reading here in verse 14. I know we've already read that one, but we didn't get much beyond it, so let's just start there. Joshua 23 and verse 14 says, "And behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof." Now that's pretty straightforward, but what Joshua's telling the people here that he's gathered together toward the end of his life, what he's telling them is God's done all he said he would do. And because he's done all he said he would do, there's no reason to believe that he won't always do what he says he'll do. So we need to have our faith and trust in what he promises he will do, and be warned that when we don't fulfill the things he's asked of us, that he's not going to continue to just bless us. I mean, God's not going to continue to bless our country, and he has blessed it, if our country keeps turning its back on him. I mean, there is a consequence for that, and there's no sugarcoating it. Now, I know these devotionals are meant to be encouraging, but they're not meant to be misleading. I have to be honest with you. While I can encourage the individual and I can help them to better serve God, the nation is going to be judged. And so, as I would that everybody would work together to turn the nation around, but my job is to help individual people find the Lord and follow him and disciple people. So I can't really speak to what's going to happen to America, but I can say that we've got to turn it back to God. We've got to get our hearts back in the right place. And we'll see that. This is the same thing that Joshua's telling Israel. I mean, it's the same thing. So he says, look, all the things God said he would do, he's done. Look at verse 15. "Therefore, it shall come to pass that as all good things are come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so shall the Lord bring unto you all evil things until he had destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you." So he's giving them a potential blessing, but then a warning. If you follow the Lord, if you do the things he's asked, if you honor him with your life and as a nation, he's going to give you everything he promised. And this land is evidence. And see, this is very fitting today, because the land we live in, with the blessings we've been given, is evidence of God's potential blessing for his people when they honor him and follow him. You have to remember, this country started under religious persecution, and because the people held to their God and followed him where he sent them, he blessed them and grew, and he's done so much for this country. He's built it out of nothing. There was nothing here. God built this nation out of godly people who honored him and who followed him and who were looking for a place where they could worship him freely. Now, you can believe in God or not believe in God, but you have to at least accept the historical context of that statement. And the same had happened for Israel. There were people in Israel who didn't honor God like they should, but the nation as a whole was full of people who trusted God. And Joshua calls them together and he says, you have seen God honor his promises and give you this land. And it was already furnished. You already had homes. You already had farms and vineyards and olive trees and all of these things that he calls fatness of the land. This is already there. So he's just reminding them, just as the good things came about that God promised, the bad things are going to happen that he promised too if we don't honor him. So verse 16, "When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods, and bowed yourself to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you. That's my wife's alarm if y'all can hear it, and I'm not going to go turn it off, so I hope you can hear me over that and ignore it. I don't even know where it is. Anyway, when we transgress the covenant of the Lord, this is true today. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord that he's commanded us to follow, and specifically when you've gone and served other gods and bowed down to anybody other than our God, then you're kindling the anger of the Lord, and rightly so. He says, I am a jealous God. That's what he said. And so it grieves him and it hurts him when we turn against him and worship other things besides him. And by the way, these don't have to be a particular deity that we believe in. These can be things that we put more importance on. Our money, our possessions, even our cell phones can become gods. So just keep that in mind. Those are the things that you spend all your time and energy on or in. I know people who make a god out of the rodeo. And I don't mean anybody in this community specifically, but just places I've lived and people I've known. There are folks who chase every rodeo they can, and they put it before their love and honor of God. I know people who have other things that they get, sports and other things that they're so important that they'll put them in front of God, and they'll be more faithful to them than God. And so you have to be careful with this, because the Lord, if you get him angry with you, he can take away everything he's ever given you. So that's important. But we close out the chapter with that, and then we come to chapter 24, and it's very similar, yet different. And this is one of, if not my favorite chapter, but it does contain my favorite verse, what I like to believe is my life verse. I think all preachers have one. This one is just happens to be mine in verse 15. But let's look at the context. Chapter 24, verse 1 says, And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. There's a whole lot of significance to Shechem. I could talk about Shechem for the next hour. There's just so much that goes on there that's important. Shechem, also known in the New Testament as Sychar, and there are theologians who will disagree with me, but put it this way. If Shechem and Sychar are not the same city, they're within maybe a mile of each other, 2 miles of each other. They're very close together. They both fall into this valley between the two mountains, the mountain of blessing and the mountain of cursing, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal. And there's a natural amphitheater there. And there was just a lot of things done at Shechem. I don't have the time in this devotional to be as thorough as I would like to be about that. But I invite you to study about the city itself and the things that were done there, the historical things that were done there. It's similar to Gettysburg for us, I guess, or Vicksburg, or Lexington, Concord, some of the places that have historical meaning to us, that things happened. Boston probably be a better example because of the Tea Party and because of the massacre and because of there's been several massacres in Boston, but there's some cities that stand out in American history because of all of the historical significance and importance that we put on that city. Shechem was like that for them, except it had spiritual application as well, because God gave them specific commands there, and they set up remembrances of this. They set up stones for that. So that's all I'm going to say at this time about Shechem, but it's very interesting that this is where he gathered them. He didn't gather them at Jerusalem. He didn't gather them at Shiloh, where there was, where I believe the tabernacle was at this time, or Bethel. He didn't gather them at any of these other holy sites. And he did not gather them in a place that belonged to Judah, which is also interesting. At least from memory, I don't think Shechem was in Judah. I could be mistaken about that, but I don't think so. I think Shechem was further to the south, I think. But anyway, it's fine. I'm not looking at a map right now. But just note that Shechem was an important place, and he gathers them to Shechem. And he calls for the elders of Israel and for their heads and for their judges and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Now remember, at the beginning of chapter 23, he called all the leaders together. It says all Israel for their elders and for their heads and their judges and for their officers. In chapter 24, it says all the tribes. Specifically, he wanted all the tribes of Israel to one central location so he could talk to all 12 tribes. And remember, some of them, like Reuben and Gad, were on the east side of the Jordan. At least the half of Manasseh was east of the Jordan, and I believe Gad was as well, if I'm not mistaken about that. So some of them had to travel a ways to get to Shechem. But anyway, they're there. He asked for their heads, their judges, their officers, and I don't know how much time passed between chapter 23 and chapter 24. But we know Joshua's up there in years, and he knows his time is short, and he just wants to make sure that he's lined everybody out before he dies. And there's some really good information in this chapter, so let's carry on. Verse 2. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus saith the Lord." This is a picture of church. I wish to God that we could get more people to gather in churches on Sunday, because where else are you going to learn what thus saith the Lord? You know, how are you going to please a God that you don't talk to or don't hear from or don't congregate for? You can fill the bars up. Even during a pandemic, you can fill the bars up with just multitudes of people. And when people are looking for a good time, I've seen at the lake. I've literally passed by the lake on my way to church before, and I've seen the place packed on a Saturday or Sunday. Well, it'd be a Sunday for church, but just packed over the weekend. And you get to the church house, and there's just a small fragment of people that are there, and it's just frustrating. When Joshua gathered all of Israel together so that they might know what thus saith the Lord, and it grieves me at my heart, because if Americans don't begin to care again about what Jesus has to say, about what the Lord has to say to us, then we're doomed anyway. I know this isn't very encouraging, but it is true. So what I hope we'll take out of this, and for encouragement purposes, is we'll turn our hearts completely to Him and trust in Him, and make sure that we're hearing what He wants us to know. And we can't do a lot about these other folks other than witness to them. But even that's limited. I mean, once they've made their decision to hear it or not hear it, you really can't go any further. You can't browbeat anybody. We got to tell everyone we can. But anyhow, I'm getting off track. But he gathered all these people together, and he said to them in verse 2, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." Now, other side of the flood, well, it's a significant statement that I'll probably spend a little more time on tomorrow, because I don't want to get off on that. But Terah was the father of Abraham, and Nahor was his brother, and he's telling you now that Abraham, who they hold in high regard as their Father Abraham, excuse me, I'm sorry. Abraham, who they held in high regard, he says, look, even your patriarch had a father who served other gods. So this just, it's significant here. I want to make sure that you understand what he's saying, that your people didn't necessarily come from the best track record. God has chosen to honor and bless you and walk with you and show you His power and His presence. So don't get high and mighty and think that you can't fall and turn back to those ways. The warning here says, look, even from back then, before this thing began with Israel, before there was an Israel, God reigned and ruled, and all people belonged to Him. He didn't have a specific people then, because they weren't here yet. Now, He knew what He would do, but with Abraham, he began the nation of Israel. So this is speaking of before Israel was a nation, and making sure that they understand where they came from, who their forefathers were, and what they did. And by the way, if you don't study history, you have the danger of repeating it. Somebody once wisely said that the only problem with history is that we don't learn from it. We just don't seem to, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But anyway, we need to try to. We need to know where we came from and how we came to be. And in your own life as a Christian, think about who you were before you were a believer, and how God has changed your life and brought you to the point where you're at. He says, Terah, the father of Abraham, they served other gods. And Joshua doesn't want the people to go back to that because he knows what that would mean for Israel. He says, and I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood, and we're going to come back to that term when we have more time, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac, and gave unto Isaac Jacob and Esau, and I gave unto Esau Mount Seir to possess it. We talked about Edom yesterday. That mountain was given to Edom because God still loved Esau even after all of those things. You're going to say, no, wait a minute. Malachi says God hated Esau. He wasn't talking about Esau. Malachi wasn't written until after all the things Edom had done to Israel. So don't forget that. God was talking about Esau's nation that started up after him. He was talking about Edom when he said that. And he was talking about because of all they had done. But just keep in mind, he says, I gave unto Esau Mount Seir to possess it, but Jacob and his children went down into Egypt. And I sent Moses also and Aaron, and plagued Egypt according to that which I did among them. And afterward I brought you out, and I brought your fathers out of Egypt. And you came unto the sea, and the Egyptians pursued after your fathers with chariots and horsemen unto the Red Sea. And when they cried unto the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them, and covered them. And your eyes have seen what I have done in Egypt, and you dwelt in the wilderness a long season. Now, I'm not going to read any further today because there's some more of these things that he's reminding them of. This is a brief historical summary that Joshua's giving them, reminding them all God's done for them. And some of these things, well, most of these things that he's mentioning to them were done before some of them were born. Remember the 40 years in the wilderness, the older generation died out. And some of those kids, they saw some of this, but they didn't experience it. And none of them experienced Abraham. I mean, that was 400 years prior. So he's just reminding them of their history, and we need to be reminded of ours. He's showing them the things God has done to preserve them and to teach them and to grow them and to bless them. And listen, you could take the history of America and you could lay it right next to this story, and it's applicable because the same things are there. You could say, how talking, depending on where, people originated. I know that we're all different ethnicities in this country, but just speaking as a whole, we all came from other nations. With the exception of the Native Americans, and even, I don't even know that they were indigenous to this country. I don't know. But they were here before we were, and that's fine. But whatever your ethnicity, God brought you to this place, built this place, and grew this place based on the faithfulness of those who served him. It's safe to say the Native Americans did not follow him. And that's a debatable statement in and of itself. Some are going to say, well, they didn't have the same. See, I believe that we all came from Adam and Eve, and then by default through Noah. And Adam and Noah both had the knowledge of God and the knowledge we needed to serve him. So wherever the Native Americans originated from, even they had forefathers that had this knowledge that should have passed it down to them. So I don't want to get off on that, but I want you to understand that while individually you may not be able to find fault with them, as a people group you can, because God created us all, and he's always given us a way to know him if we want to know him. So I don't believe anyone has an excuse, but regardless of where your background lies, God has given us the ability to live in a country that he has blessed, and to give us the ability to know him now and know how to know him better. We have the Word of God here. And just so you know, the Scriptures predate anybody who lives in America. I don't care what scientists tell you. The Scriptures have been around for 2,000 years. You look at your historical facts and see well, I'm just getting on a whole other tangent there, but just trust me, the Scriptures have been available longer than 2,000 years. The Old Testament was available longer than that. So I don't believe anybody has an excuse for why they weren't following God, other than they just God reveals Himself to people. So that's a whole other deal. But let's focus solely on what Joshua was saying to Israel and how it applies to us today, and that is this: that God has blessed our country. He's taught us about Himself. He's given us the means to know Him, the means to be blessed continually. And as fast as we can, we're turning back to what eventually happens to Israel is going to eventually happen to America if we don't get it straightened out. So let me leave you with a few more words, and I've got to stop. I know I've gone over. I used to try to keep these under 15 minutes, and now I can't understand under 20. But there's some more encouraging stuff that's going to come later, but the sobering stuff has to come first. You've got to recognize that our country is not headed in the right direction, and the only thing we can do about it as individuals is be the leaders that God called us to be, make the changes we need to make, and make sure we teach those things to our children and our friends and anybody who will hear it. And just honor the Lord with our lives. Let's all have a spiritual return to Shechem and a reminder of what God's done for us. And let's think on these things and study these things for our own improvement and for the Lord. Let's just honor Him with our lives. Hope you guys have a great day. I hope you got something out of this, and pray for me. I'll try to do better in the future.